Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's 2-Minute Warning featured interview, where we take a deeper dive into the energy transition and, of course, its implications for the Middle East as well as globally. We're joined here today with our distinguished speaker, Dr. Morgan Bazilian, Director of the Payne Institute and Professor of Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. Welcome to the show, Morgan.
Thanks for having me, Brian. A pleasure to be with you.
I just wanted to first start with the U.S. Of course, as you know, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network recently published an action plan for U.S. decarbonization, which you played a key role in. Can you just touch on that briefly, and then also which elements of that plan that you see being deployed, of course, in 2021 and the year moving forward?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much. So the report is from some organization called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. The plan is called America's Zero Carbon Action Plan, or the acronym is ZCAP. They call it a comprehensive policy framework to present a carbon neutral economy in the United States by 2050. It was chaired by Jeff Sachs at Columbia, and essentially broken into chapter working groups. I was involved mostly on the power sector, so co-chaired the power sector work with David Victor of UC San Diego. The overall strategy, again, looks at a 2050 net zero plan, and it essentially looks at 4 pillars: energy efficiency, decarbonizing electricity, which I'll mention more, switching from fossil fuel combustion to electricity, so electrification, and then carbon capture and storage, CCS. So it's pretty wide ranging, includes some quantitative modeling. You know, our work on the decarbonizing the electricity sector, of all the sectors, of course, the electricity sector is sort of doing the best, so to speak, on moving towards cleaner fuels. And that, coupled with possibly increasing demand for electricity because of electrification. Electrification is a horrible term for meaning that other sectors of the economy will move to electricity as their service. And, you know, we looked at the technology aspects. We looked at the cost declines in wind and solar, et cetera. We looked at, and then some policy prescriptions, including, you know, increasing R&D, of course, and whether you could do a national or at least have most states in some sort of zero carbon portfolio standard. So the overall report looked at jobs. So there's you know, the amount of jobs that were created. They say the number rise, you know, 2.5, 3 million, 4 million new jobs. The jobs numbers are always a little difficult to get to. But, you know, I think overall, one of the important things it does is not only look at CCS as part of the mix, but also acknowledge that the other sectors of the economy outside of power have a long way to go. So I think it's a useful exercise. It's one of several that are coming out on the topic, and did have a section on just transition. So the idea of mostly looking at the jobs aspect of just transitions, which is a part of it. So I think a useful exercise. The report's available. It's online, as is all the modeling. And to say what it will do as far as influencing policy in the very short term, well, that would be pretty difficult to say. Academic papers or papers written by academics don't often translate directly into policy prescriptions, but let's say that there is at least a reasonable menu of things out there.
And of course, you know, touching on the policy side of things, we just had a U.S. presidential election. Joe Biden will be taking office at the end of January. What do you think his first climate-related move should be once he settles in? And is there anything tangible from, of course, that action plan that was put forward that you think the groundwork for it can be start to lay out in 2021?
Yeah, so I think if we separate what can happen in a Biden administration on climate domestically and then internationally, it might be a useful framing for how to discuss it. So we can start with the latter. Of course, he named Senator Kerry as climate envoy very early on in the cabinet naming, and that climate envoy has a place at the table at the National Security Council, and so it was seen as a good way to integrate international climate into domestic decision making at the highest level. And so I think that institutional or organizational move shows, yes, they're taking it very, very seriously. They put someone with a great stature in the role and give it a place at the table, so to speak. What that does for the United States' reputation internationally is a little harder to say. So the reputation has been relatively severely damaged on the international climate front over the last 4 years. And moving from that level to leadership, I don't think that's exactly what the goal should be. In other words, let's see some repairing and mending of relationships, and let's see some U.S. domestic focus getting its own house in order before discussing things like naming and shaming, which has come up in some of the language of the Biden administration. Certainly, rejoining Paris is an obvious and easy thing to do. They've talked about it several times. That in itself, while doesn't have a lot of content with it necessarily, it does seem like the reasonable diplomatic thing to do and an incremental change to show participation. So, on the international side, I think you'll start to see, as you expect, re-engagement, et cetera, from the United States. The domestic side, well, and I think as I've seen on some of your websites, on the international side, we also saw Dr. Al-Jabbar from the UAE being named yesterday as a special envoy for climate change. So same language as, I believe, as Senator Kerry's title. And so you're seeing, along with the US re-engagement, before it, you saw China, Korea, Japan, UK, European Union, et cetera, all taking goals and steps out to 2050 on climate that are rather aggressive, at least from a optics and communications perspective. So you see movement at the international level, and now you see the United States re-engaging. On the domestic side,
just from that foreign policy aspect, do you think the acceleration of those climate targets, let's say net zero targets from the large economies such as China and Japan, do you think that will accelerate US commitments next year to kind of make sure that we're catching up to those type of levels?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that the Biden plan will put together a net zero goal on its own. It's already drafted that in the campaign documents from the Biden campaign. You can go online and still see them. It has the same kind of language around the same kind of timeframes that China, Korea, Japan, EU have put in place. So I'm not sure how much those plans are going to push the US. I think that the US is going to go that way regardless, but it'll be good to see it joining the rest of the world for a change. And the same goes in reverse. Will the US plan, whatever it is, when it comes out on climate, will it influence the other countries? Well, the other countries have been moving along without the U.S. for some time now, and so I don't see the reverse happening either. I think it's mostly about a re-engagement, as I said, and diplomacy.
And then, as you were discussing domestically, how do you see that impact, or how do you see things evolving?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. It's in the U.S. There's been, over the last couple weeks, not just since Kerry got named, but just as Biden got named as president-elect, you saw the media coverage. There must have been 15 different articles that had lists of 6 or 9, or in one case 41 on Bloomberg, things that the U.S. should do, primarily domestically, on climate, assuming a hostile or unfriendly Senate. So that's the situation where the Senate is in control of controlled by the other party, not in the presidency. There are no shortage of those ideas, and they range from using agencies like the EPA or laws like the Clean Air Act to reframing and visioning various parts of the government, from the Department of Energy to the Department of Interior to the Treasury, et cetera. And a lot of those plans come from Obama era ideas. A lot of the people who are putting them forward worked in the Obama administration. There are plenty of good ideas. There's no shortage of them. And I'm sure that the administration has them, in hand. Which ones of those will get enacted quickly is not clear. But there's certainly possibilities to work with. From my perspective, while the content of those things, from carbon taxation, as I said, to agencies, to institutions, there's a sort of agreed list, if you will. The more important aspects are going to be how you structure those, how you decide on the people operating them, and how you make them sustainable in some way. So, as we saw when and this is a problem both internationally for the United States and domestically, as you see when a new administration comes in, if they can simply tear down the sandcastle of these policies or regulations, then international partners can't trust them, nor can domestic firms see a long-term signal. So certainly, legislation would be a superior goal to work with, and I think there might be some areas where that can happen, although likely limited. But certainly, transacting those lists, just to have them knocked down again, it has to be top of mind for the administration right now.
And so, of course, we have the runoff elections in Georgia for the Senate coming up in early January. Do you think that having that overall Democratic government, or Democrat-led government, do you think that would be better in terms of instilling confidence for international relationships and commitments towards these climate targets moving forward, as you just touched on?
Yeah, I guess it depends on who the international parties are, who the states are that we're talking about. But certainly from a domestic perspective, the ability to transact legislation with a democratically controlled Senate and Congress and White House would make it a lot easier to pass long-standing legislation. But importantly, I think for your listeners, yes, there's a runoff for Senate seats in the state of Georgia. In the U.S. state of Georgia, but the states have been leading on a lot of these policies throughout the Trump administration and throughout Obama administration. So I think one of the things that the new administration will likely look to is how to further empower the states to enact these policies, right? The states have the power over a lot of these sectors, from oil and gas to electricity, and how they operate and how they're staffed and how their budgets work will be as important, if not a lot more important, than what happens at the federal level. Of course, like most countries right now, and at the sub-federal or sub-national levels, the US states are suffering budget-wise, of course. And so, if you don't have the budgets to put into these well-designed or well-meaning policies, then, well, you don't get results. So certainly the overall economic situation of the virus, the pandemic, is pertinent here as well, of course.
And where do you see, domestically, how do you view the reception that's been from industry in embracing these policies and that, let's say, energy transition moving forward? I know we recently spoken to a former member of the International Envoy for Energy under the Obama administration, who was under the viewpoint that, when you look at oil and gas and some players in the energy sector, this transition and moving more towards a green economy is a key aspect for that industry to be the most successful and most competitive in the future. Are you seeing the reception from industry back in the US, that idea taking hold, or is there still some resistance?
Well, I think there's certainly some resistance. I mean, that I think empirically that you could find evidence for that. It depends on company by company and sort of sector by sector. But if you look at oil and gas right now, especially gas, the gas market got hit a lot more by the decision by the French 𝖬𝖷𝖢 to cancel a $7 billion 20-year contract of LNG than it did by anything coming from the administration or from the progressive part of the Democratic Party, et cetera. So, I think that one's pretty clear. In other words, that LNG shipment was not stopped by a Greenpeace warrior sailing ship. That was stopped by the government of France for their perception on what was happening primarily in the Permian Basin, apparently. It's not clear to me that decision process by the French government, if it was related to flaring or whether it was related to methane. I don't think it's come out in any report that I've seen, but regardless of what the decision was, I think at least the natural gas industry got a pretty big wake up, and I think you're going to see reactions to that. You already have from various companies, certainly the LNG suppliers, international suppliers on their buying chains, and you also saw reactions from individual companies and signing up for, say, things like methane, transparency and rules and monitoring, et cetera, as well as maybe some slight moves by the Texas Railroad Commission on flaring. So, on the gas side, I think that they've been prepared, if there was a change in government, to be under considerably more pressure, at least on the emissions side. And I think you'll see that almost immediately. Well, you've already seen it even before Biden has come into play. The oil side, it's not as clear to me. It's not as clear to me what that reaction is going to be. Certainly as you see, the large IOCs, especially from Europe, are pivoting already and have been for some time. What the small and mid-cap players do is not as clear. They have a lot less levers. They don't have as big R&D departments. They don't have operations globally. And so they have a lot less degrees of flexibility to move. And I think that I don't know what you call it, a meme or a narrative around no more, but banning fracking really shook some people in the industry. And once it became clear that there was not going to be some kind of ban on fracking, which is not tenable or not doable, but that there is the possibility to do something on federal lands. That all of a sudden everyone is doing analysis in the consulting shops of what where are the federal lands? And it does look like some states, like the state of New Mexico, that is already fairly hard hit economically, could have some issues there. But all of that, I believe, or most of it, had been foreseen by the industry well before the election. And so I think other parts of the industry, the energy industry, from electricity to technologies like CCS, we're thinking about this kind of transition regardless of the result of the U.S. election.
So the foundation was already being laid for that transition.
I think in most of their strategy sessions, at least somebody at most of those companies had those kind of, that the transition itself, the inertia of it is significant and moving in a certain way. Yes, I'm sure that some would have liked to seen a slower movement towards pressure on say methane emissions. But even there, when the rollbacks came from the Trump administration, you saw letters from Exxon the next day in the newspapers saying it was a bad idea. So I think most of them were moving in that direction regardless, is my understanding of it.
And just, again, touching on worldwide, what is occurring globally. We touched briefly on net zero earlier. Do you think that there's enough being done worldwide to build a foundation for a net zero future by the mid-century when these targets are putting out there, or do you think it's less viable and there's not as much substance there at the moment?
Yeah, I think that's the right question. Look, I mean, it's always been the case that it is politically attractive and relatively expedient to put out long-term plans, right? In every topic, not just in energy. So it's relatively easy to say in several decades, well after I'm going to be out of office and well after I might be gone, that we can have a policy, right? That's always been how government works. It's easier to do that. The hard part is, as you suggest, laying down the incremental pathway for how you get to those plans, especially for things like multi-year budgets. And what we're talking about here, going to net zero, is a much more significant change, even in some aspects of the fabric of society than people like to acknowledge. There's a couple ways to look at it, right? So there's at least that dichotomy between the long-term long-term goals and the short-term pathways, which I think is significant. We did some scenario work for the German government last year, and that was one of the big outcomes of it, that you have to, marry the short-term with the long-term. Okay, it's easier said than done, and it gets into politics and it gets into deep design, and it also gets into how you interact with society. So, communities have a big role to play in these transitions. And, while oil and gas companies have been dealing with and addressing and doing good jobs and bad jobs on social license to operate for a long time, on the renewable side, if you want a lot of high voltage transmission systems crisscrossing your country and you don't live in China, you have a significant issue of social license to operate that you don't have quite as much experience in as, say, the pipeline companies, who obviously have lots of experience in it. So there's those social aspects, and then lastly, there's an issue of pace. The pace of change matters. And how you can steer, we talked about the inertia in the system, how you can steer these big ships of global or national energy systems. If it happens too quickly, well, it can be very difficult from a domestic political perspective, right? Depending on what your country, the resources and how its economy is shaped. If it goes too slow, then you get into the situation you're talking about, where you lose faith of your electorate, or you lose faith in your decision making or your design processes, et cetera. So there is, like everything, a middle ground. A middle ground is not often attractive to that many people. Some people want it to go faster, some people want it to go slower. And so finding that pace is a really important part of this transition as well. Do I have confidence that we'll make these 2050 net zero targets? Yeah, I'm of a mixed mind about it, but certainly, certainly technologically they're feasible, and so from people like myself that tend to have a technocratic perspective, sure, you can make it happen technically. I can make the curves in my analytical models look any way I want, and I do believe the technologies are there. Whether society and political systems enable that transition, I think, is the real big question, and the one we should be focusing on.
I think that was going to be my follow-up question, in the sense where we look at society, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic going on. How well received is this transition, and the understanding of the benefits behind that back in the US at the moment? Is it touching that third pillar of that stool in terms of public acceptance and understanding?
So what the wonk journalist, media, academic crowd like to cite in response to that question is, well, we've done lots of surveys, and the population really wants this. Now, I have very little faith from a mathematical perspective in the rigor of those surveys or their results being useful, and we've seen that in election after election. I think people in general, it depends on how you frame the question, but if you frame it, would you like clean air and clean water? The answer is yes to all sorts of society. The answer to the question is, do you want to be inconvenienced? Are you going to make your lifestyle more modest, or et cetera? Okay, then you're going to get different kinds of actual responses in the comfort of your own home. But I think more importantly, we've been doing a lot of work on this idea of just transition. So the idea that, just transitions has mostly been addressed in terms of coal plant and coal mine closures, at least in the United States and Europe. And that is just being the short for justice, that if a plant closes, then, okay, you need to find new jobs for the people who worked in the plant. Of course, the problem is significantly more complicated than jobs. So it is true that it is not all that difficult to change from a coal mining or coal power plant job to a wind turbine power plant job. They're both large industrial systems. It's possible, and it's doable with retraining, and their programs exist. The impacts, though, on the tax revenue and the tax base and the community identity are much more significant and much more difficult to either replace or transition. And so we've been doing a lot of work on that community aspect. And in the United States, you're seeing that live, as it were, right now in states like, again, traditionally with the coal, it's been West Virginia or something like that in Appalachia. But what we're seeing now is, of course, places like Wyoming and New Mexico facing, rather existential issues for their societies. Where a place like Wyoming, with their resource, they had their own sovereign wealth fund in the state of like Alaska and several others in Wyoming. The university was free, there, low taxes, et cetera. That is changing dramatically right now. And so how they navigate that transition, I think, is going to be a really important one for the success of the wider transition, and the lessons learned from it are going to have implications for not just societies and communities in the United States, but resource-dependent communities all over the world, right, who are also grappling with this. So how does Saudi grapple with it? You can see in the UAE for years they've had 𝖤𝖷𝖢𝖫 and a diversified plan for the economy through industrial policy, right? So they've embraced industrial policy. You're going to have sectors of the economy, whether it's processing chips or aluminum or other things, and it's very well planned. That tends to be easier to do when you have a significant amount of money to plan it and develop it than it does in, say, countries, least developed countries in other parts of the world. So yeah, how those transitions go is far from just a technical issue, as we've said several times now, and not addressing the socio-technical systems, or not embracing the system as a socio-technical system, will lead to well, it won't lead to success, and there's quite a lot of complicated discussions to have in there that are political and economic and equity, etc.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're just coming up and wrapping up at the moment. But before we do, are there any things that we should be watching out for, let's say, in this overall space, in this overall transition as we head into 2021? Any signals or any things that we should be monitoring heading into January at the moment, outside of, let's say, just the U.S. presidential transition?
Yeah, I think, well, at least in the very short-term things I see happening. So you're talking in the next, months.
Yeah.
One very short-term thing is what happens in natural gas markets and international trade of LNG, as we discussed, right? So I think you're going to see a very swift movement towards standards and life cycle assessment, et cetera, of natural gas, at least U.S. natural gas, and probably global. Well, it's not a global market, of course, but even in the regional markets, you're going to see contracts tied to supply chain transparency of emissions. And I think as a result, sort of that natural gas contract being taken away, you're also going to see that in other places that touch on the energy system. And so, we do a lot of work on this, what we call the mineral transition, foundations of the energy transition. That is, if you're going to have a lot more solar and batteries, et cetera, then you're going to need lithium and manganese and nickel and cobalt, et cetera. You're already starting to see a lot of pressure on different industrial supply chains from two communities, both on the ESG side. So the investors, the ESG investors, and they want to see transparency and methodology. That goes from natural gas to minerals to industrial goods, and from the companies themselves that are trying to do the reporting for their buyers or for their investors. And what we've been finding is, this is sort of hard to say from an academic perspective, but it's complicated. So I know that sounds cliche and maybe not so helpful from your company perspectives, but there needs to be a really short-term effort and big focus on clearing up some of these supply chain methodologies and data sources so that companies, investors can make the kind of decisions they want to be making.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to participate in our 2-minute warning interview today.